Hi all, great to have you with me for another episode. Today, for a haunting, we're on the way to the gorgeous English county of Dorset, down in the southwest, to investigate a truly inexplicable story. Wait till you hear it. If you want to help support this podcast and everything I do here, please go to patreon.com, find me, Neil Oliver, and sign up to the channel. Another way that the channel is supported is by our sponsor, Gold Bullion Partners. And if you're thinking about investing in precious metals, being gold and silver, these are the guys to talk to. It's a direct, personal service. You speak to real people, they'll talk you through the entire matter, and you can decide together if it's something that's right for you or not. One thing Gold Bullion Partners say is buying gold and silver is about wealth preservation, safety and control, not speculation. So if you want to find out what it all means, and if it is the right idea for you, check out their website on the link in the notes down there beneath the video. Okay, let's set off on a trip that connects Los Angeles, California, and a little house in Dorset called Mount Cottage. There's something uniquely odd about this one. It's set in a little cottage, Mount Cottage, in a village in West Dorset. But before I get to it, are you aware of houses having atmospheres? I'm talking specifically about houses that you lived in as children or at any point in your life, really. I ask because Trudy and I often talk about how the two main addresses that we've had together as a family, two different houses in Stirling, have felt very noticeably benevolent to us both. The subject came up at some point, and we agreed that we had both, without ever conferring with the other, had felt very safe, kind of cradled, I suppose, in both addresses. Such that, if you had to be on your own in the dark in the house at night, with nobody else there, never at any point have either of us ever felt anything spooky. On the contrary, particularly in the first house that we lived in Stirling, this came up, and we both, one of us said it had happened, and the other immediately said, yes, I get that too. And it was that sometimes, especially on the ground floor, but sometimes on the stairs, we would have a sensation of walking through a kind of almost like a golden hued cloud. There was something slightly out of focus momentarily. It was like just passing through something, on the way from one part of the house to the other. And also here in this completely separate, completely different house, we've both experienced that, and it always feels very safe, as though only peaceful times have been experienced in both addresses. And I often think about the first house that my family lived in Dumfries, where I did most of my growing up. It was a house on Annan Road, and that house was different. We had I'm talking about in the early 1970s, we moved in there, and there was a basement that we used just for sort of storage, and there was a coal cellar down there, and in the big room, the biggest room down there, my mum had the washing machine, and my mum did B&B, bed and breakfast, for a few years in the 1970s, and so there was a lot of laundry to be done, lots of sheets and pillowcases to be washed, on a daily basis. And she'd be down there, and we'd all be at school, and my dad would be away at work, and she'd be on her own down there. And it was a big old top loader washing machine. I remember it being kind of red, mostly cream, but red, an old-fashioned thing with a paddle in the drum that turned back and forth, made this swooshing sound as it agitated the water around the laundry. And my mum hated being in there. My mum didn't like the house, and she definitely didn't like being in that basement on her own. She was a rational adult. like the rest of us. But there was something about the house. So I just wonder, you come back at me and let me know if you've ever lived anywhere that's felt one way or the other, benign, malign, whatever. And I ask it because this particular story about Mount Cottage in West Dorset is about an experience he's had in the place. Two specific experiences separated by time. When I wrote the book, my literary agent, who's called Eugenie, she phoned me. I mean, obviously she knew what I was writing. And she said that she'd been speaking to a friend of a friend. I don't think this person was directly Eugenie's friend, but they were connected maybe by an intermediary. And Eugenie had cause to speak to her. And they'd had a long, rambling conversation, and the subject of the sort of paranormal came up. And this woman, who's called Sasha, related something to Eugenie, which Eugenie then related to me. And I was suitably inspired to contact Sasha myself to hear it at first hand and to get much more detail. She was called Sasha Marov, and right at the beginning of the conversation that she and I had together, that to her it had seemed growing up and in her adulthood that her family, her immediate family, even her extended family, had one way or another seemed to live in a succession of haunted houses. It had been a recurrent theme. They'd lived in various places, obviously as, sort of nuclear family, and then the offshoots of it lived in other places, and they had they'd had a recurrent experience of haunting. She was English and from England, but when I was speaking to her, she was living outside Los Angeles, California. Sasha, she's a writer. She wrote screenplays, for TV and movies. That's how she was connected to Eugenie, my literary agent, because Eugenie also looks after people who not just who write books, but who write other stuff like screenplays. Writing screenplays or writing was something that ran in her family. Her maternal grandmother was Alice Mary Dilk, who lived from 1919 to 2016. Now remember Alice. In the golden days of Hollywood, Alice, Sasha's grandmother on her mother's side, was a reader employed by the movie industry to find books and scripts that might, be developed as movies. She worked for, amongst others, Victor Gollancz, and she worked for Warner Brothers through some of the heyday of Hollywood. Dr. No was a novel that she read and thought would make a good film, but Warner's passed on it. She was working for Warner's at the time, and they didn't want it. And then later, amongst others, she noticed a play by a guy called Frederick Knott, which became Dial M for Murder, which was directed for the big screen by Alfred Hitchcock. So Alice was in among it. A reader of note. She read all the time. She read widely. She was also a great thinker. She was a critical thinker. She was always on the lookout for new ideas. And she married a fellow writer, a guy called Christopher Dilk, who was a scion of another literary family. So, so Sasha's descended, from writing types. And during World War II, Christopher served in the Royal Artillery, and he rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. So he had his war years really working in intelligence. And after the war, he worked for the BBC, amongst others. He wrote books, he wrote for film and radio. Alice and Christopher together had 4 children in 2 sets, 2 pairs. They had a pair of youngsters before the outbreak of the Second World War, Caroline and Annabelle, and they had Fisher and Lucy after World War II. And from and this is important. This is the heart of the matter. Between 1941 and 1945, they rented Mount Cottage in Dorset. At that time, they had Caroline and Annabelle as youngster babies, really. And Annabelle would be, in time, Sasha's mother. okay? But she was a baby and a toddler in Mount Cottage. And it was pretty basic when you hear about it. They got water from a spring. It was like a well. There was no electricity in the house, so it was all candles and tilly lanterns. Alice had to grow her own vegetables in the garden. She had family nearby. That she was connected to that part of England, and she had brothers, Giles, Sam, and Henry, and they weren't in the same village as her, but they were in Dorset, and they would come by, and they would have visits. So she wasn't entirely alone. But I mean, you might think it was kind of, I don't know, swallows and Amazons idyllic, but Alice remembered it and talked about it to Sasha, her granddaughter, as being a place of sadness. She was sad in that little house. She was just a young wife, a young mother of two. Her husband, Christopher, was away on active service, and she was a single mum, effectively. She was raising two little children alone in pretty basic circumstances, hard work. After the war, the family moved to Camden Grove in Kensington in London, and they had the two youngest born there. So that much of the growing up happened in Kensington. Fast forward to 1970, and Alice inherited some money, family money, and she bought for £6,000 Vale House near the village of Whitchurch in the Marshwood Vale in southwest Dorset. So she's regularly connected to Dorset. And from around 1975, she lived there full time. Husband Christopher died in 1987, and from that point on, she lived alone. And Sasha said she lived alone, but for a rotating cast of cats and dogs. Sasha said, "My family have always lived in haunted houses. That's how it is. Ghosts in every one, it feels like. It's the way we've been." I thought, how odd to be within an extended family that takes for granted that there are ghosts everywhere they go. She loves California. She's happy to be there. She's where they are outside of LA. That the air is clear. It's good for thinking, good for writing. And she had just, when I was on the phone to her, she had just been visited by a cousin and her cousin's partner who'd come out on a visit. And she said, "It's funny because my cousin and I spent the whole time talking about how whenever we can't sleep, we go back in our minds to Granny's house in Marshwood Vale. We can remember every single detail of the house, the books on the coffee table, everything." And so together, Sasha and I, we speculated about whether it was something to do with her family, members of her family tending to form especially strong bonds to houses, wherever they are, I don't know, imprinting on them and being imprinted by them in turn. I mean, I suppose maybe some people just pass through addresses, and have a superficial, practical connection to them. Maybe other people become a bit more bonded and bound to the place for various reasons, maybe on account of circumstances and events that unfold for them in that place. Sasha said, funnily enough, I was having a dream the other night, and you don't often talk to strangers about their dreams. And she said, in California, in LA, her family there had a close connection to a family who were Navajo, Native American Indian. And she said that they had learned through spending time with them that for the Navajo, ghosts are regarded as useful presences in life, a natural part of life, actually. Encounters with ghosts are to be expected and learned from, and that experiences with and in the presence of ghosts, say the Navajo, enable and facilitate a better understanding of the world of the living. And Sasha said, anyway, she said, in the dream, I was having a conversation with a Navajo elder. And he was saying that what has to happen in the United States is that all the descendants of the European settlers, all the people that have come into North America in the last 200 and odd years, had ghosts to confront. They needed to confront their ghosts. Because ghosts are a way to talk about the past. They're a manifestation of the past, and that the sins of the past and ancient trauma can be can be brought forth and dealt with via ghosts. And that basically the Navajo say emotions are better expressed using the sort of medium of ghostly encounters. So, to get to the haunting, this is so odd. This is the oddest ghost story I've ever heard. It's sometime in the early 1990s, and Sasha she couldn't remember the date, but early 1990s, Alice, grandmother Alice, an old lady by that point, happened to be a guest at a party in a house in Dorset. And at some point, she realised that she had tuned into, she was overhearing a group talking about something. You know that way you do. You suddenly realise that you've hit the frequency, and you listen to people on the other side of the room. You know what they're talking about. And they were this young couple were saying that they had to move out of their house that they'd been staying in because it was too haunted to live in any longer. So her ears pricked up, because remember, Alice is someone that figures that she's lived in one haunted house after another. So Alice, quite elderly Alice, joins the conversation. Excuse me. And she, first of all, she says, where were you living in Dorset? What house? Because she'd lived in a few addresses, and she certainly knew the area and was still living. She was now living in Vale House in Dorset, had been since the 1970s. And so she figured that she'd like the precise details. And they said it was Mount Cottage. It was called Mount Cottage, and it was the village. And so Alice said, I lived there. I lived in that house during the war. And furthermore, she said, I don't remember any ghosts there. I was there for 4 years. I don't remember anything like that. And the couple said, well, there's a ghost there now. So Alice says, right, tell me exactly what you've been seeing. Because, Alice could remember the house. She'd had life there, experience there. She'd had her eldest children there. And now she was hearing from a young couple that had found the house so frightening they couldn't live in it. So they said more than once, multiple times, they had seen a woman crying, weeping by the side of the fireplace in the sitting room. It was clear. It was nothing fuzzy about it or indistinct. They had seen it separately and together. It was a young woman with brown hair, and they saw her regularly. So far, so familiar. As far as Alice was concerned, this sounded like just your standard ghost fair, spirit of a young woman, whatever. But there was, let's get to the point, said the couple. What was disturbing was something that the ghost of the young woman did every time she appeared. She would be weeping. She would be filled with sadness that they could feel. She never engaged with them. She was never aware of their, there was no sort of, as though she was seeing them. But while crying, she would turn, put her head against the wall beside the fireplace, and bang it. She'd bang her head against the wall, hard enough to bleed. So, nights without number, the couple had to watch this weeping woman bang her head against the wall until there was blood on the wall, staining it like a rose, and they couldn't take it anymore and moved out. Alice, she'd not been haunted in the cottage, but she had altogether different memories of an altogether different experience. Back in the war, while she was living there on her own with the kids, there had come a day when Christopher, her husband, had sent word, a telegram, asking her to go through his papers, whatever, a desk, maybe, whatever, a briefcase. There was something that he needed, to be reminded of, and he sent her to find it. And she obliged, but in doing so, she ran across letters between her husband and another woman that made it plain to her that they had been having an affair. And Alice broke her heart with the news. She's all alone. Her husband's far away, and now she's discovered that he's been unfaithful to her. And she was already vulnerable, she was isolated. And the news of the betrayal was just like too much. It was just too much for her. And she had, on reading it, on discovering the betrayal, she had stood stood by the fireplace and she had turned and banged her head against the wall until she bled. Now, Alice is still alive at this point. She's listening to a couple who've had their own experience of her house that she had lived in decades before. And as far as it went, Alice was a ghost, while still alive and living elsewhere in Dorset. Somehow or other, she was also, unbeknownst to her, haunting her old home. As I say, it's the oddest, most unexpected ghost story. You know, the couple had no way of knowing what experiences Alice had had there. She was a total stranger to them and they to her. And at that point, Alice hadn't told anyone about it. It was a deeply held secret. It's just something she had never talked about to anyone. Sasha did say that her family, some members of the family, tended towards the dark, of depression, let's say, sadness. What do we even mean by depression? You know, it's kind of an overused, misused word in many ways. So, although she had left Mount Cottage long ago, she stayed together with Christopher. They lived out the rest of their life. After the war, they had 2 more children. So the question is, did she inadvertently leave behind the essence, the residue of heartbreak? You know, so the question is, are we haunted not just by the dead, but by the living? Are we haunted by ourselves? Sasha's own dad died when she was 2. And get this, people of a certain vintage will remember this, he was the Bulgarian dissident and writer Georgi Markov. And Georgi Markov was murdered by the KGB in 1978 with a pellet of poison that was injected into his leg via the point of an umbrella. It was an infamous news story. Because obviously it was like a plot for a movie. So he died, and at that point, obviously his widow was left behind with, Sasha to raise, and Granny Alice had helped, in the upbringing. And Sasha's cousin, the one who had recently been on the visit to California, had also lost her mother when she was young, and Alice had helped with her upbringing as well. So Alice, Granny Alice, was pivotal, very important to the raising of 2 of her grandchildren. And according to Sasha, she was a lovely grandmother, attentive and loving and great fun and so on. Sasha said, she told us all about a world of magic and understanding. My grandfather died in 1987, and although she lived alone, Granny had tons of visitors. She was a wonderful, complex, deeply intelligent woman, a very deep emotional core, an emotional projection that was so strong. She was a formidable character and she loved us. Sasha said, she's kind of the reason we're all okay. Which is a fine way to be remembered. So, the experience that Alice had in the 90s on encountering this couple, it brought it all to the surface for her, and subsequently she spoke about it. She aired it all with the family. Sasha knew about it, but she hadn't spoken about really her time in her wartime home up until that point. And kind of word then percolated out through the family, and word of Alice's experiences in the cottage reached the 2 younger children, the ones that were born after the war, in another address entirely, Fisher and Lucy. And they had their own ghost story to recount, which they in turn had not really mentioned much about, but they said that in the Kensington house, which was the house that Christopher and Alice moved to, after the war, that they had sometimes seen an apparition dressed in black and sitting on a landing on the stairs. And they had known, somehow or other, that it was their mother, their living and breathing mother, and yet not her. So, what is it about Alice? So that Fisher and Lucy had their own experience of encountering their mother when she wasn't there, not in the physical sense. She was somehow there, or some avatar of her was there when her physical form was somewhere else. And Sasha said she'd obviously thought about it a great deal. She said that her grandmother was possessed of, as she put it, an emotional projection that was so strong. And I wonder, on listening to it, if there was some sort of truth, some instinctive understanding for Sasha and the family of what was lying at the heart of it all. Such that was Alice unconsciously experiencing emotions and then projecting them outwards such that they could adhere, like the scent of expensive perfume, to the fabric after she was gone from the place. You know, was she manifesting some sort of phenomenon? I said, because of all the kind of movie connections, asked Sasha if her grandmother had ever actually made it to like Hollywood and had all of that experience in the studios. But no, Alice did all of it remotely, as it were. She did all of her work from England and just, sent stuff out, whatever, phone calls and letters. That's how she did it. She never went west. It had been a dream, but she never got out there. So, until, like I said, I came across Sasha and the Markov family late in the day. The book was all but written. And I had thought, based on my own experience of ghost stories, that there was a commonality about them. And I've read hundreds of ghost stories. I've had all sorts related to me over the years directly. And people have determined that it has to do with something that happened in the past. People long gone, the dead. Wrongs inflicted on people now dead. Awfulness, great trauma experienced then. And they're whatever they've experienced lingering like glitches in the Matrix, or out there like clips to be downloaded and witnessed over and over by inhabitants of the present. Or else, in the case of the dead, an idea that there's some sort of version of them exists in limbo, reliving a moment over and over again, and in some way insisting that the living live through it too, and I don't know, in some sort of payment of the debt of upset and fear. Obviously, people who've listened to the rest of this, about the story of the wee black car on Sky. That was different as well, and it had some sort of some overlap. The wee black car. It was less a lingering of the past. It was a portent of what was to come. It was actually a premonition, a prophecy of a tragedy that was subsequently fulfilled. But for the rest of the ghosts, what are they? The ghosts serve, or they answer a timeless need, or they hold at bay a timeless dread, I think, which is fear of death, fear of pain, fear of suffering. And when it comes to death, I think for most people, if they're honest, anything is better than death. Even existence as a ghost might seem better. An immortality of a sort might feel better than just ceasing to be, which I think is what a lot of people fear more than anything else, just being gone. In a book called A Natural History of Ghosts, Roger Clark, he explains why England, as far as he's concerned, is extraordinarily haunted, more haunted than anywhere else. I mean, amongst the many things that seem to set the British Isles, the British archipelago apart, it would seem, based on the available evidence, that this place is especially haunted. There's more ghosts per square mile than anywhere else. And Clark wrote about how the Catholic Church, over its long dominion, appropriated the ancient pagan belief in ghosts. The world that they encountered was full of ghosts and spirits, and the pragmatic church, which the Catholic Christian Church was pragmatic. It absorbed and repurposed the notions of the people that it encountered. It made them its own. And the Catholic Church listened to these stories of ghosts and interpreted them as glimpses of souls in purgatory, people held in a limbo as a punishment for something or other in their lifetimes. And then as the Catholic Church evolved and as the Middle Ages progressed, there was a determination then to clamp down on the ghost business and to declare it wrong, even to talk about them. It was a sin even to suggest that you were in contact with the dead. It's like necromancy. And then, came the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and the monasteries and the convents and the rest of the properties of the Catholic Church were taken and appropriated, and monastic communities were scattered, and a belief then developed amongst the general populace that when the monks and the nuns died, that they were kind of held by or drawn back to the ruins of the places where they had lived. But there was a way in which this evolution of the Catholic Church had got to the point where, rather than taking ownership of and kind of shepherding the spirits, the spirit realm, they abandoned them and left them to roam. So that, rather than the idea of it being souls in purgatory and the whole matter was under control and interpreted and made sense, the progress through the Reformation made it plain that ghosts were something to do with the devil. Evil, just evil. And because by the end of the Reformation, or as the Reformation progressed, they were disowned. The ghosts were disowned, or the idea of ghosts was disowned, and it left the general population susceptible to the stories again, and they had to find their own way to accommodate them and make sense of them. So, it was a kind of a perfect storm. You now had all these ideas and suspicions of and beliefs in spirits, ghosts, and there was nobody taking care of it. Nobody marshalling it anymore, and so they went rogue. The whole idea of ghosts went rogue. And Clark wrote, "Belief in ghosts never became respectable, but its popularity was bolstered further by a new form of Christianity that tacitly espoused a belief in spirits and ghosts in the form of Methodism." So the Methodist Church stirred the pot again. So it was through this sequence of events, it was through the involvement of the church, first the Catholic Church, then the Reformed Church, and then other iterations of Christianity, that ghosts went through a metamorphosis. And rather than souls that might find salvation and be gone, they were just seen as having nowhere to go, no hope of release, and so just persisting. The worst kind of sitting tenants. They were trapped in whatever purgatory they were in, or whatever liminal state that they were in. And so, all in all, it was this that laid the foundations for a plethora of haunted places all over Britain. One church building, one stately home after another, all of them with resident apparitions, religious and secular. Iona Abbey, Windsor Castle, Glamis Castle, Rainham Hall, St Peter Advincula Church inside the Tower of London, Borley Rectory. All of them haunted. All of them stuck with their ghosts for good or ill. There's Blickling Hall in Norfolk, the childhood home of Anne Boleyn. Her apparition appears there on the 19th of May in particular, which is the anniversary of her execution. There's Newton House in Carmarthenshire, haunted by the ghost of Lady Eleanor Cavendish. Her husband-to-be had followed her home when she knocked him back, and he strangled her. During the 1980s, a TV crew came to see if they could get her on film, and a camera operator swore blind that he felt hands on his throat. She was strangled, he felt strangled. Where else? Whitby Abbey in West Yorkshire. Long before Bram Stoker came to Whitby Abbey to write Dracula, there were reports in the Abbey of a a novice nun who'd broken her vows and was bricked up inside a wall to die a miserable death. Brighton's Preston Manor, another contender for Britain's most haunted. There are more stories in Preston Manor of ghosts than a person could shake a stick at. On and on and on it goes, this litany of spirits, until Britain feels like a landscape smothered and muffled by the departed. Sasha's experience, or rather her grandmother's experience that she recounted to me, and the wider experience of the Markov family, makes me wonder if where you bring ghosts, you find ghosts. That whatever is in you, your experiences, your subconscious, your trauma, do you carry it with you, and does it manifest from time to time as ghosts? I'm made to think about my own experience of life and death. At the time, my mum has died now, but at the time I was writing the book, it was in the aftermath of my dad dying. And I see my dad, but not as a ghost. I see him every time I look in a mirror. I see him looking back at me through my own eyes. I've picked up some of his mannerisms and some of his foibles. I hear myself saying things that my dad used to say that I never said while he was alive. With my kids, sometimes if there's, sitting in the car, there's maybe a pause in the conversation, I'm apt nowadays to say something like, well, there you go, which just to fill the space. And my dad did it. I never used to do it. But now that he's gone, it's just one of a number of his quirks that are coming back through me. He used to, when I was a kid, my dad always asked if he could have his cup of tea or cup of coffee in what he called a thin mug. And he meant that he wanted something like fine bone china. He didn't want a thick rim on his cup. And when I was living at home, it used to annoy me. I used to think it was just downright pernickety. What difference does it make what cup you got your tea in? And now I do it too. I look for and ask for a thin mug as well. And I don't remember when that started. When my mum was clearing out after he died, she found some socks that had been bought, but they were still in the cardboard. They'd never been unpacked, certainly never worn. And they were socks of the sort that my dad liked, which was the toes and the heels had a different patch of colour than the main body of the sock. And I took ownership of them and I wear them. And I get a funny kind of comfort or connection from walking about in them. I think belief in ghosts comes ultimately from fear of death. I think there are other reasons for it, many other reasons, but I think fundamentally we fear death, and that there's anything better than dying for most people, especially people raised in an increasingly secular environment, where we cling to the idea of disembodied spirits because it allows us to hope that something survives, something carries on, that so that even an eternity as a ghost hanging about disturbing the living, which is definitely a suboptimal existence, it's something. It's better than nothing. And the idea that some spirits pull it off and manage to linger, it might reassure us that that's better than disappearing altogether. So what about Sasha and Alice? We talked more. She spoke particularly, Sasha, about the recent visit of her cousin and her partner to her home in California. When they were in when the two of them were in bed, like in a whatever bit of accommodation for guests, and they were trying to sleep, music had started coming through the speakers. There were speakers in the room, and it was nothing they had put on. It was no music that they knew, and they thought it was something techie. They thought that maybe Wi-Fi speakers were picking up and transmitting something picked up via Bluetooth from a neighbour or whatever, but they couldn't get it to switch off. And so they were lying in bed, the couple, and first of all, Sasha's cousin became aware of a figure in the room, a figure with flailing arms and angry, an angry presence in the room. And her partner then could see it as well. They were terrified, and it lasted for a few moments and then it disappeared. Sasha said, we talked about it for days. My cousin is a doctor, she's a scientist, but she was adamant about what they had both seen. Sasha said that her family had lived in one haunted house after another, that ghosts were a given, and she meant it, and she had the evidence. Well, she had the examples to prove it. And over the years, Sasha had learned to wonder if her family were just given to dark moods, and the depression that they found hard to talk about, and that sadness manifested ghosts as an externalising of their unhappiness. And once they could visualise or experience their own unhappiness outside of themselves, it made it easier to let it go. She said that her cousin had felt angry and upset on arrival. I don't know why, but she'd sort of arrived in a bad mood. And that after the incident in the guest bedroom, when she got through the night and emerged into the morning, that she felt good again. That as though her anger had left alongside the flailing figure summoned by the music. More than once I've mentioned Archie Roy. I mentioned him in the context of Culloden Moor in the Scottish Highlands, and his turn of phrase about a sense of something strange. Archie Roy was a professor of astronomy at Glasgow University, which is where I went to university. He was a very distinguished scientist. He was a prominent astronomer. He was a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. He was a fellow of the British Interplanetary Society. And he was so much of an expert on orbital motion that NASA approached Archie Roy for his help designing the shape of orbits for the spacecraft of the Apollo 11 programme. So, whatever you think happened to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in 1969, let's not get into that. Archie Roy was a serious scientist, but he was also a fellow of the Society for Psychical Research. So that at the same time as being a serious man, he was also known as Glasgow's Ghostbuster. And for the last decade of his life, he spent a lot of time investigating and assessing claims made by mediums and clairvoyants, because he felt that whatever it was that these people were describing was something that should be investigated by the scientific method. And he attended all sorts of haunted houses, reportedly haunted houses. He was especially interested in poltergeist activity. And so it's up here somewhere, his book, A Sense of Something Strange. It was a Christmas present to me from my mum in 1990. And I've read it multiple times. Basically, said Roy, this book contains just a few of the things that have, over the years, invoked within me a sense of something strange. I remain agnostic. But, I read about something like the wee black car on the Isle of Skye, and I listen to Sasha talk to me about her grandmother. And the hairs go up on the back of my neck and I feel a sense of something strange, which is a physiological response at the very least. He died in 2013. Robin McKee, who's a writer in his own right, produced an obituary in the Guardian newspaper for Archie Roy. As an anecdote, he recounted how Archie Roy was ambidextrous, and he would stand in front of an audience of students and say, let us consider two intersecting circles. And while he was saying that, with a piece of chalk in each hand, he would draw two perfect overlapping circles. He was an interesting character. He was an orderly man with an orderly mind, but his mind was open. So with him in mind, when I hear from people like Sasha and when I listen to and read about all of the rest of it, I won't dismiss their testimony out of hand. And when it comes to the idea of something persisting after death, something surviving after whatever death is, I remember that Archie Roy, a man of science, said, if I die and find out I have not survived, I will be very surprised.